A Ferris wheel turning against a California sky. A private zoo full of exotic animals. A train that circled an estate the size of a small town. For 30 years, that was the image the world had of Neverland Ranch, a fantasy built for one family's children to enjoy without limits. Then, in August 2026, Paris Jackson sat down across from Alex Cooper on Call Her Daddy and quietly dismantled almost all of it. Not with outrage. Not with a bombshell accusation. Just with the plain, matter-of-fact memory of someone who was actually there, and whose version of events looks almost nothing like the one the tabloids sold us. So what did she actually say? And why does it matter, nearly 2 decades after her father's death, that she's the one finally telling it? Before we get to what Paris said, it's worth remembering what most people believed for 3 decades, because the gap between belief and reality is really the whole story here. Michael Jackson bought the 2,700-acre property in Los Olivos, California, in 1987, paying roughly $19.5 million for land that had previously been known as Sycamore Valley Ranch. He renamed it Neverland, after the island in J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, where children never have to grow old. Over the following years, he turned it into something that had never really existed before, a private residence built around a fully operational amusement park. There was a Ferris wheel, a carousel, bumper cars, a zoo that at various points housed elephants, giraffes, and tigers, a 50-seat movie theater, and a working train with its own station. It was, by any measure, one of the strangest and most extravagant residential properties ever built by a private individual. And because Jackson was arguably the most famous entertainer alive for much of that period, Neverland became shorthand, in magazines, in late-night jokes, in the public imagination, for a specific idea, that his 3 children, Prince, Paris, and BG, formerly known as Blanket, were growing up inside a permanent, personal Disneyland, free to ride and roam whenever they wanted. That idea had staying power for a simple reason. Almost nobody who actually lived behind those gates was talking. For most of Paris's early adult life, the closest the public got to a first-hand account came from her older brother Prince, who testified in 2013 during a lawsuit related to their father's estate. Even then, his account quietly complicated the fantasy. He described Neverland as a homey place where the kids could visit the zoo or ride the Ferris wheel only on special occasions, saying their father wanted them to remain humble. That detail didn't really break through the mythology at the time. Part of the reason is structural. A single line buried in court testimony doesn't compete with 30 years of magazine spreads and paparazzi photos of a Ferris wheel silhouetted against a California sunset. Visual mythology is sticky in a way that legal transcripts rarely are. It took Paris, more than a decade later, sitting across from one of the most listened-to interviewers in the world, to actually pull the story apart in front of an audience large enough to change how it's remembered, and to do it in her own words, not filtered through a lawyer's questions or a biographer's paraphrase. It also helps to remember just how unusual Neverland was as a piece of real estate in the first place, because that's part of why the mythology took hold so easily. There has arguably never been another privately owned residence in the United States built around a fully functioning amusement park of that scale. Most extremely wealthy families build large houses, elaborate gardens, maybe a screening room or a stable. Michael Jackson built a working carnival with his own address. That single fact made it almost irresistible for the press to assume the obvious, uncomplicated conclusion. Of course the kids who lived there had the run of it. Why else would it exist? Paris's account is compelling precisely because it answers that why else question with something the public never seriously considered. The first thing Paris corrected wasn't a detail about the rides or the zoo. It was the basic premise of the story, how long she actually lived at Neverland at all. "I didn't grow up there," she told Alex Cooper. "It was only the first few years of my life that I was there." That's a significant clarification. Paris was born in 1998, and by most reporting the family's time actually residing on the estate had ended by the mid-2000s, meaning her lived memory of the place covers a window of early childhood, not the full run of years the public has spent decades attaching to her name. The idea of growing up at Neverland implies a defining, years-long backdrop to her whole childhood. Her account reframes it as something closer to an early chapter that ended before she was old enough to fully register what made the property so unusual in the first place. That single correction matters because it changes the shape of everything that follows. If she only spent her earliest years there, then whatever she remembers isn't the memory of a teenager who had the run of a private carnival for a decade. It's the memory of a small child whose days, by her own description, looked far more ordinary than anyone assumed. When Alex Cooper asked her to describe an actual day at Neverland, Paris didn't reach for the zoo or the rides. She reached for a classroom. "I'd wake up and I'd go to school," she said, explaining that she and her brothers were homeschooled on the property. "We'd go to the room that was our classroom, and we would go to school." It's about as far from the tabloid image as a description could get. Not a child running between attractions, but a kid walking down a hallway to sit through lessons, the same basic structure that homeschooled children anywhere might recognize. Paris also described a phrase that, in her telling, became something like a governing rule of her entire childhood, not just at Neverland, but wherever the family lived afterward. "If you're good, and you do your chores, and you do your homework, and you do the things you're supposed to do, then maybe you get a reward." The rides, the zoo, the movie theater, none of it was framed to her as a birthright. It was framed as something to be earned, on a good week, if the basics were handled first. That's a meaningfully different psychological picture than unlimited access to a personal theme park. It's a household with rules, consequences, and a fairly conventional incentive structure. Chores and homework first, fun as a possible reward, not a guarantee. And notably, when that reward did come, it wasn't always something exclusive to Neverland at all. Paris has described being taken to places like Chuck E. Cheese as a treat for good behavior, the same kind of outing millions of ordinary families use on a random Saturday, happening for a little girl who technically had a private zoo a short walk from her bedroom. There's something almost disarming about that detail. It suggests a father who, whatever else is true about him, was at least trying to instill some sense of normalcy and earned privilege in kids who otherwise had every reason to grow up entitled. Whether or not you find that framing convincing depends a lot on how you already feel about Michael Jackson, but as a piece of testimony from someone who was actually there, it's hard to just wave away. It's also worth noting how consistent this account has been across the years, rather than something that only surfaced now for podcast attention. Paris gave an early, wide-ranging interview back in 2017 in which she described not fully grasping the scale of her father's fame as a small child. She has said she simply thought of him as "Dad," rather than one of the most famous entertainers alive. That same interview touched on the masks she and her brothers were sometimes photographed wearing in public as children, which she has explained were less about theatrics than about her father's concern for their privacy. He reportedly didn't want strangers to recognize their faces on sight. None of that reads as a family performing openness for an audience. If anything, it reads as a private household that happened to exist inside one of the most photographed properties on Earth, two very different things that the public spent decades treating as the same thing. Here's where Paris's account does the most work to overturn the public narrative, and it's the detail that's been repeated across nearly every outlet that covered her interview. The attractions at Neverland, she explained, weren't primarily there for her or her brothers. According to multiple outlets that reviewed the Call Her Daddy episode, Paris said the rides, the zoo, and the theater existed largely for underprivileged and terminally ill children, kids who, in many cases, might never otherwise have gotten the chance to experience anything like it. Michael Jackson had a long, well-documented history of hosting groups of sick and disadvantaged children at the ranch, an arrangement that turned much of the property into something closer to a recurring charitable visit than a private family playground. If that's accurate, and Paris has no obvious incentive to inflate her father's generosity towards strangers while simultaneously describing her own access to those same attractions as limited, it inverts the entire assumption people have carried for 30 years. The rides weren't sitting there for the Jackson children whenever boredom struck. They were largely reserved for guests. Paris and her brothers, by her account, were more like residents living alongside someone else's foundation than children living inside their own amusement park. It's worth sitting with how strange that actually is, once you say it plainly. A little girl growing up a few hundred feet from a Ferris wheel that was mostly for other kids. Not because anyone was being deliberately cruel to her, but because the entire property had been built around a different purpose than the one the tabloids assumed. There's also a detail in the timeline that makes this reversal even sharper. In 2003, the entertainment program Entertainment Tonight was invited onto the property for an on-camera tour just months before the criminal investigation began. Camera crews and, at various points, groups of visiting children were literally walking through gates that, according to Paris, she and her brothers needed to earn access through good behavior on a good week. If her account is accurate, strangers on a press junket or a charity visit sometimes had more casual access to Neverland's attractions than the children who technically lived there did on an ordinary Tuesday. That's not a detail that makes for a scandalous headline in the traditional sense. Nobody did anything wrong by inviting sick children to enjoy a private zoo. But it is a detail that quietly undoes the entire premise the public built its assumptions on. No honest account of Neverland can leave out what happened in 2003, because it's the reason the ranch stopped being a family home at all. That year, Santa Barbara County investigators searched the property as part of a criminal investigation into child molestation allegations against Michael Jackson. He was charged, and the case went to trial. In June 2005, a jury acquitted him on all counts, but the trial effectively ended his relationship with the ranch. He never lived there full-time again, and the property that had once required its own train station to move guests around began to sit largely empty. Over the following years, the amusement rides and the zoo animals were removed. Jackson defaulted on loans tied to the estate in 2008, and after his death in June 2009, the property passed into new hands, eventually being renamed back to its original title, Sycamore Valley Ranch. It sat on the market for years, listed as high as $100 million in 2015 and repeatedly reduced, before billionaire investor Ron Burkle, a longtime associate of Jackson's, bought it in December 2020 for roughly $22 million, reportedly viewing it as a long-term land investment rather than a home. The gates that once opened for camera crews, celebrities, and busloads of children now don't open for the public at all. It's a strange arc for a piece of land, built as the most elaborate private playground in American celebrity history, and now essentially a closed, quiet ranch that a billionaire bought because the price was right. The fantasy didn't end with a dramatic final chapter. It just slowly stopped being maintained. Long before this podcast interview, Paris had already been forced into the kind of spotlight most adults never have to handle. When Michael Jackson died in June 2009 at age 50, an 11-year-old Paris stood up at his memorial service and spoke to a global television audience, in a moment that remains one of the most replayed pieces of footage connected to the Jackson family. It wasn't planned, and by her own account in later interviews, it happened almost before she or anyone around her had time to process it. She has said she still hasn't gone back to watch the footage herself. That detail says something on its own. 17 years later, a moment experienced by millions in real time is still something she's chosen not to revisit privately. Grief doesn't necessarily resolve just because the rest of the world moved on and stopped paying close attention. Given everything, the trial, the scrutiny, the documentaries, the decades of public debate, you might expect Paris to use a platform as large as Call Her Daddy to either defend her father point by point or distance herself from his legacy entirely. She did neither. Asked to describe him, she's spoken about him warmly, calling him funny and describing him as one of her closest relationships growing up. She's also been candid in this and prior interviews that it has taken her years to arrive at whatever peace she has now with his complicated public legacy, and that she and her siblings choose to honor his memory in their own way, without needing the rest of the world to understand or agree with that choice. That's a notably restrained position for someone who could have used a massive platform to relitigate 30 years of headlines. Instead, she offered something more personal than a defense, an account of a father as she actually experienced him as a small child, alongside an open acknowledgement that his public story remains genuinely contested. Both things, in her telling, can be true at once. The Neverland material was only part of the conversation. Paris also discussed getting sober, a milestone she has publicly marked as beginning in early 2020, describing it as one of the most significant turning points of her adult life. She spoke about the end of her engagement to producer Justin Long, and about growing up largely without her biological mother, Debbie Rowe, in the picture. She touched on new music, with an album reportedly on the way, and on lighter subjects, including what she's called her Saturn return, the astrological framing many people in their late 20s use to describe a period of major personal transition. Taken together, it's a wide-ranging portrait: discipline and reward, grief and warmth, sobriety and reinvention, delivered by a woman who spent her earliest years behind the gates of one of the most mythologized properties in celebrity history, and who has spent every year since trying to be understood as more than a footnote to it. It would be easy to file all of this under celebrity gossip and move on. But there's a more interesting story underneath it, and it has less to do with roller coasters than with who gets to control a narrative in the first place. For 30 years, the public built an entire mythology around 3 children based on assumptions nobody bothered to verify with the people who actually lived it. Paris, Prince, and Biji didn't get a say in how that story was told while they were growing up. A criminal trial reshaped public perception of their childhood home before any of them were old enough to weigh in on it themselves. Tabloids filled in the blanks with the version that made the best headline, not necessarily the version that was true. What Paris did on that podcast wasn't really about correcting facts about a Ferris wheel. It was about reclaiming authorship of her own memory, deciding on her own terms, decades later, what people should actually understand about the classroom she sat in, the chores she did, and the very ordinary rule that governed her extraordinary childhood: be good, do the work, and maybe some weekend, you'll get the reward. That's a far less cinematic story than the one the world has been telling for 30 years. It's also, by the account of the person who was actually there, the true one,